Thank you so much for the introduction, and it's a great honor for me to speak here. Also, as a Presidium member of the UN Association, I was requested by Katalin to speak a bit about human rights, humanitarian law, and rule of law issues, as these are at the very core of the credibility questions of the United Nations. Well, all three of these are huge topics, but they are interconnected, so I will try to first speak a bit separately about each other and then connecting them. If we think about human rights, I think the first thing that comes to mind, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which has been a great achievement of the UN in 1948, and it serves as a basis for all the later conventions adopted at the UN, from the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, leading up to the not so, more recent convention for people with disabilities. And we can see that these conventions have created a wide array of institutional background and institutions and offices and committees to serve as means of enforcement of execution. However, later I will say that the problem lies at that part of the situation. And we can definitely say that one of the biggest developments in human rights protection is the ever wider recognition of groups in need of protection. So first it was the issue of the colonized nations, of racial discrimination, and by today we can say that this protection covers refugees, stateless people, women, children, minorities, indigenous people, people with disabilities. So there has been a clear development, I think, since the establishment of the UN. However, if we just look at some very, very basic numbers, every day in Gaza about 100 people dies. Mexico, which is not even an armed conflict country, every day about 80 people dies of homicide. So even in countries where we do not have an armed conflict, we can have situations which result in, well, not the best protection of human rights. And this also leads us to the next topic, international humanitarian law. International humanitarian law has been created to serve as legal background in armed conflict situations, while we actually know that there should not be any armed conflict if we would respect the UN Charter. Article 2 says prohibition of the use of force. So if everybody would respect that, we wouldn't even need really international humanitarian law. However, we have a big corpus of international humanitarian law, also thanks to the UN, in very big part with the Geneva Conventions and with the Genocide Convention and with several other conventions providing for that. However, when we see that there is this legislative background, we know that it is not fully respected. To counter that, the responsibility to protect idea has been started about 20 years ago. And we actually really hoped that it would lead to the general acknowledgement of prohibition of genocide, prohibition of crimes against humanity, that nobody should commit that, and that if it happens, nobody should veto it in the Security Council. Nobody should veto any act against these situations, and that states should commit themselves to avoid these worst crimes on earth. Do all states respect that? No, unfortunately not. They don't even commit to that, and sometimes they even question whether what we see, for example in Gaza, is a genocide or not. And these fields actually have led us a bit later to the question of the rule of law. The rule of law has not been an old concept like human rights or humanitarian law. But in 2006, the General Assembly have adopted a landmark resolution on rule of law, and that it can be globally respected, and that it is not only a European concept. And in 2012, the General Assembly made a declaration of respect for the rule of law, promotion of the rule of law, and they also meant under that that international law should be respected by member states of the United Nations, and that this respect should also mean that they establish those domestic procedures, those national legislation that is necessary for international law to thrive. So what is common in all these three fields? Well, they are all part of the SDGs. Judy has already spoken about the SDGs. If only we just look at goal 16 with peace, justice, then we would find all of these, and that it has been accepted by all member states of the UN to improve these fields as well with improvement of the Sustainable Development Goals. Also, what we can see is that actually we have good, well-established legal background. As I mentioned, there are loads of conventions. We have the legal background. We know what are those crimes. We know what are the human rights violations. The law is there. But where is the problem? Well, the problem lies at enforcement and at execution of the rules. And I think that if I'm not looking at that from the lawyer's point of view, then I can say that the biggest problem is that some states do not respect at all these rules because they know that being a bad guy pays off. Actually, for some, the law of the jungle is preferable because they gain from that. Do we want the law of the jungle? Well, me from Hungary, definitely not. It's never good for the small ones. Maybe for the biggest ones it can be useful, but for a small country that's never good. And in the United Nations, out of the 193, actually most of them are small nations. So for most of the world, the law of the jungle is not something that we should not have that, because that's not good for most of the international community. So we should figure out how to persuade, again, those states to respect the established rules, the established world order and system. I'm not sure that actually we can create a much better one in legal terms, in textual terms. But I do think that the problem lies somewhere where everybody spoke about, that in the minds of policymakers, in the minds of politicians, of diplomats, this is where it has to change, so that they would like to respect the rules, they would like to keep to it, even when it's not so good. I have 2 children. Of course they do not like to respect the rules sometimes, but we try to make children also to respect the rules. It's not easy to persuade them when adults are not respecting the rules as well. So, all in all, for the credibility of the UN, I think we should not blame the UN for mistakes of the member states. For those actions, what is not the UN's action, but it's actually made up of the member states, and it's the action of the member states. Of course, the UN has a big role in showing a mirror, in trying to establish impartial, legitimate, clear actions and mandates. But we should also know that in this community, it's not the UN. So personally, I hope that we can say, sit here or in another building in I don't know how many decades and still talk about the UN. Maybe different institutional background, maybe a bit changed legislative background, but the UN as an organization, because I'm not sure we can actually figure out a much, much better one. We should respect what we have. Thank you.